and we're going to click it. Click.
Not yet. Give it a few minutes.
And we're live. It is Thursday, March 18th, 2021, 5:03 p.m. And I have a bone to pick with Google today, and it relates to our guest. So I'm going to share my screen here.
Again?
And we are going to talk about the way Google treats our guest, Michel Paradis. And it's, I think you will, what's that?
I think I know what you're about to do. Go ahead.
And I think you will find it is an unfortunate thing. So let's first notice that when you start typing Michel Paradis, it says Michel Paradis, Canadian linguist.
Okay.
Now, Michel is not Canadian and he's not a linguist.
I actually am a linguist, but it's okay.
In what sense are you a linguist?
I have a doctorate in linguistics.
You do?
I do.
Whoa. This I did not know. When did you?
That was so good.
When did you acquire that relative to your law degree?
I actually acquired I was awarded my doctorate in 2012.
Interesting. I had no idea.
Oh my God!
Not this. I should say not this doctorate in linguistics. This is a different doctorate in linguistics that has somehow merged with mine through the power of artificial intelligence.
Wait.
Sorry.
But this is not you. You are not a Canadian linguist born in 1957.
I'm not the Highlander. No.
But wait, who is that person? That kind of looks like him. That is you.
This is him.
Okay.
This is his name. These are his affiliations: Columbia Law School, Georgetown Law School, Simon and Schuster, right? But then they think you're a Canadian linguist who's 64. And you are many things, but you are not a Canadian linguist who's 64. So I just want to understand who the hell this other Michel Paradis is and why Google has you so completely confused.
It's an amazing exercise in artificial intelligence. So the original Michel Paradis is a Canadian linguist. I believe he teaches at McGill. He specializes in aphasia and bilingual aphasia, so people who lose the ability to speak or who lose the ability to speak in one language, typically after brain damage or something like that.
Broca's area.
Yeah, you can get Broca's aphasia. That's true. There's also Wernicke's aphasia, which is in some ways a lot more entertaining in some ways.
Yeah. Well, entertaining. But
and
it's because you don't use the right words for things.
I know you describe things like in a very literal, funny sense. Yes.
Yeah.
So you, separately from the existence of this other Michel Paradis, who's a Canadian linguist, you got a doctorate in linguistics?
I did indeed.
Was it because Google was describing you as a Canadian linguist? I can't do anything about the Canadian part, but I can't.
Have you been to Canada?
I've been to Canada a handful of times. Never to Montreal though. So this other Michel Paradis and I don't know that we've ever even been in the same physical space.
But you are.
But when I was a graduate student, I would occasionally get invitations to write for conferences or to give like keynote addresses on bilingual aphasia, and I was like, I'm happy to try that. However, I think you may want to reach out to the other Michel Paradis.
Well, all right. All of this is a long way of saying we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And although I have to say, discovering that somebody is not a Canadian linguist named Michel Paradis, only to find out that unbeknownst to you, he is a linguist, was a direction I did not expect this particular monologue to take. That said, welcome back to the show, Michel Paradis.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
And we are here to talk about the Eisenhower Administration. So I know what a lot of you were thinking. You're thinking the Eisenhower Administration. what a genuinely uninteresting subject to talk about. And I remember there was a magazine that I used to spend some time writing for, and once it had a editor who was, sort of famously not the most engaging person in the world, and the other members of the staff used to call his tenure the Eisenhower Administration. And so we all know why that the Eisenhower administration is a period of non-electricity in U.S. political history. And but Eisenhower is also coming into his own. The no less a personage than Jonathan Rauch has argued that he is one of the great underestimated presidents of the 20th century, a man of serious accomplishment and a model for contemporary politics. And Michel told me the other day that he is currently working on a book about Dwight Eisenhower. And I said, okay, well, come on in lieu of fun and rehabilitate him. So you've got 2 minutes to make the case that Dwight Eisenhower is not boring. Because otherwise, there's 150 people on the show right now. We're going to see how many of them stay on after your like the brief overview of the defense of Dwight Eisenhower.
I want to see if there's I want to see if the world can somehow divine that he's about to tell us the most interesting things about, and they rush to Crowdcast and jump on the thing, and maybe we increase our viewership in the time that Michel tells us about Ike.
That I make the sales pitch for.
It was 142 were active while before you started talking when I posed the question. It's at 144 now, and Matt Clifford is exactly right. We need a before and after poll. All right, here's the before poll. Dwight Eisenhower is really boring. : yes, no. Okay, you're gonna.
I have a clock. I have to hit a clock too.
No, not about. Yeah, we're gonna be. Okay.
I was not told there would be a quiz.
No, it's not a quiz. We're not going to time you to it. But make your case. Everybody vote before Michel starts talking, and we're going to, we're going to see if Michel can persuade people, can move the needle on Eisenhower.
So. Agreeing with Jonathan Rauch, to start with agreeing with Jonathan Rauch is not wrong. In fact, they did a study they do these studies every so often, but a professional historians, I think it was last done, it's either done in 2016 or 2018, I can't remember. And Eisenhower was 5th among the American presidents. And I don't think that was entirely just a reflection.
5th in what? Like
greatest president.
Oh, greatest president.
Greatest president. Yeah. We had it was like Lincoln, FDR, being the obvious ones, George Washington, and I think Thomas Jefferson squeaked in there. I'm sure the Crowdcast can remind me of who number 4 was. But Eisenhower came in 5th, and that probably surprised a lot of people in the popular press, and it was even reported with some surprise in the popular press. But it was entirely deserved. Because never have you had a combination of, I would actually go so far as to call it guile, personality, temperament, and effectiveness than you have had during the 8 years of the Eisenhower administration. It is one of the few periods in the United States history where we did not start a foreign war. It is the consequence of the Eisenhower administration that we have the civil rights laws that we have. They were ultimately passed during the Johnson administration, but they were initiated under Ike's tenure. And indeed, the federal supremacy, the reassertion of federal supremacy over civil rights matters primarily starts during the Eisenhower administration. All of the highways, everyone sort of seems to know that one, all of the highways can be attributed to Ike. So these are just some of his various accomplishments. That sort of material accomplishments that people are aware of. I'll give you a handful of other political accomplishments. Saving the Republican Party from insanity for what ended up being half a century, and essentially committing the United States to a consensus of internationalism and multilateralism that was by no means a foregone conclusion in 1952. I think you could even make the argument, though Eisenhower himself would protest this violently, that his deciding to run as a Republican in 1952 as opposed to a Democrat was a strategic move to essentially box out the resurgent isolationist wing of the Republican Party and to ensure that there would be an American consensus around, for example, participation in the United Nations, around the Geneva Conventions, which again was by no means a foregone conclusion. And certainly American history to that point had showed periods of American interest abroad quickly fading to American narcissism soon thereafter. But the other thing I'll say about Eisenhower, to say that he's the most interesting, is I think that was actually the question presented, not whether or not he was great, but whether or not he's interesting, is there are two kinds of interesting. There's the kind of interesting that the media loves and that writers often love. The kind of interesting that you get from someone like Winston Churchill or Patton or Andrew Jackson, which give you a kind of swashbuckling Vicomte de Valmont roguish charm that lends itself very well to personification, caricature, and quotation. And then there's the kind of public figure, like I would say Eisenhower, who essentially used the appearance of them being boring as their greatest asset and weapon, and ensured that they would be consistently underestimated every time they were dealing with these great swashbuckling personalities. And so the very thing that leads us today to say that Eisenhower is, boring and milquetoast and sort of part of this, Saturday Evening Post American tradition was a cultivated persona. It had there was a certain genuine truth to it. He is from Abilene, Kansas. He grew up as a farm boy and had this sort of boyish grin and ruddy complexion well into his elder adulthood. But he understood very quickly that being underestimated, being seen as not a threat, was the greatest path to the effective use of power that any true leader could actually have. And so his willingness to essentially move himself off stage, to give the spotlight to the charismatic figures, was much like the way people shake shiny keys at children when trying to get them to look in the right direction during a photograph. You want to create a shiny distraction so that you can actually get up to business out of view. And that's Eisenhower. And so that, to me, sorry.
No. So that's Eisenhower, but I want to push back on some of that, which is that he is first of all, the first general since Grant, right? If I'm remembering correctly.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. To serve. And so there's obviously there's plenty of other people and plenty of other presidents with military service, but general is pretty
Wasn't Rutherford V. Hayes a general?
No.
Yeah.
No. Well,
Yeah.
Wasn't he a brigadier general or something?
Right. He didn't come to public life. He didn't come to public life through spectacular military service.
Massive sideburns, though.
Very much like shiny keys.
Those were some badass sideburns.
But I do kind of want to ask this question, which is okay, I think that you're correct. Okay, so maybe it all depends on what our definition of boring is. But I do have kind of a question, which is he didn't have any fun scandals. He was maybe boring because he was so good at what he did that he basically made it all seem like cake. And so there's something kind of interesting about that. And what I'm kind of interested in is that he just, in my mind, he's preserved as one of the last presidents whose war record really was one of the major reasons that people on both sides of the aisle supported him. And is that an inaccurate representation in my mind, or a historical fact, or because I do think that he does do a lot with it. He is much more sophisticated than a lot of people, than Grant, you can easily say. But I'm just kind of curious what you think about that.
So I think there's something definitely to that. He's the last president to use his leadership of the United States through a great period of war as a springboard to be the commander in chief of the actual United States.
Right.
You know, Grant is one, Andrew Jackson, George Washington is sort of the prototypical figure in that.
George Washington is such the prototypical figure.
Right. And George Washington is actually kind of a prototypical figure of Eisenhower. There are a lot of sort of basic sensibilities and the willingness to use a kind of, you know, I'm quiet and being underestimated as a way of exercising power that both of them, I think, you know, had a sort of an intuitive understanding for that is actually quite remarkable, particularly in our modern era. If I can just sort of say this is an interest question. In our modern era, which is so infatuated by charm and flash and sort of the spectacular, right? We just lived through 4 years of the most media savvy president we've probably had in a long time, whose only reason for having political power was his charisma. Feral, insane charisma as it may be, but nevertheless that sense of he's a spectacle to be watched. And I kind of think maybe one of the reasons that sort of drew me to this book to this project is to think about that Donald, I think Quinta Jurecic wrote a great article in the Atlantic, which I couldn't have agreed with more, which is that Donald Trump is boring. Right there. Yeah. And there's something kind of tedious.
Because it's so shallow. It's like,
right,
it's all flashy. It's like, it is like the car keys. Like, are car keys that interesting? No, they are certainly not.
Yeah. And predictable, right? And that's sort of the thing is like someone like Patton or Churchill, I think, remain these kind of historically remembered figures because they are actually quite predictable, right? You're always going to get some saucy quip out of one of the other of them that you can use to meet an occasion. And what's to me fascinating is the exercise of genuine power in ways that ended up being incredibly transformative, really defining of the 20th century. And how, in order to actually exercise that amount of power, Eisenhower had to be this kind of retreating figure who quite deliberately was overlooked at every occasion.
And how do we know it was deliberate? I mean, you know, you're quite right that there are these larger than life figures all across the Allies in World War II, including Montgomery, right? Who's not, you know, like it's not sort of larger than American life, but for the British, this was a big deal. And none of them commanded the D-Day operation, right? And Eisenhower, you know, has probably the most magnificently complicated logistical operation ever run, just in terms of, and just kind of gets it done. How much of, but why are you confident that the Kansas farm boy thing is an act as well as true, as opposed to just being who he was?
Because there is a ferocious intelligence and sophistication that you see with Eisenhower in his more private moments and settings, and a deep understanding of how to use sort of quiet, soft power as a way of achieving aims that might be extremely unpalatable to people, but that can be sold as long as he's sort of smiling at them and giving them a bit of the Kansas sort of noble savage charm. And so I'll give you like one sort of like interesting example of this, since you brought up Montgomery. Was in planning of the D-Day invasion, one of the things he quite concertedly did was gave Montgomery command of all ground forces landing on the Normandy beaches. And in reality, he and Omar Bradley were essentially deeply organizing the attacks on Utah and Omaha Beach, as well as the control of the paratroopers that we deployed, because Eisenhower understood as a strategic matter that moving west and getting control of Brittany, which is the sort of the western fork of France, was far, far more strategically important. And so he orchestrated so that the U.S. naval forces, as well as U.S. American ground forces, were in the West and able to therefore open up access to the Atlantic, essentially to be able to control and then access the Atlantic, which as soon as we set foot in France, all of a sudden no longer made Great Britain the leading imperial power of the world, but gave the United States essentially entirely free movement in Europe. Now, that doesn't mean he was rough with the Allies. It doesn't mean that Great Britain was like a puppet state in some way. But it was this just sort of subtle sense of understanding that that certain kinds of decisions really mattered when it came to the exercise of power, but that you could not make those decisions. You could not at least have the success in exercising that kind of power if people saw you as trying to exercise it. And so he always made sure to divert any conversation that got too serious to fishing and other kinds of sort of casual personality traits that ensured that people always underestimated. And that doesn't mean he's duplicitous, but it was this kind of sense of, I know how to, I know what I actually want. And so how do I get that? And if, eating shit and making everyone think I'm stupid and that I'm being pushed around by Monty is the way to get that, well, then that's just what I'm going to do, because at the end of the day, I'm going to be in control of France.
So I love that. I had never thought of him. I just want to, sorry, I didn't want to
go ahead, Kate.
I just want to say that I never thought of him in that way. But of course I should have. Like, of course, all of the evidence was there to know that he wasn't some type of kind of hayseed, right? That rolled out of Kansas. And I identify with that a lot, just personally. I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it.
Right. So just to quick finish that thought, right? He's the Kansas hayseed who goes on to lead the coalition in Europe, become the supreme commander for all of Europe in Allied forces.
Allied forces, yeah.
Then leaves to become the president of Columbia University, only to be quickly appointed as the first leader of NATO, and then to be the only personality from the Second World War period to go on to greater political life in the presidency, right? You could argue JFK kind of used his war record as a burnishing credential, but not MacArthur, right? MacArthur certainly had designs on the presidency, probably from his fetal stage. But it's Eisenhower.
I will say that being president of Columbia University sounds analogous to having a constant root canal. So I would rather it sounds awful. So it's no wonder that he moved on to NATO. That sounds
That's
better.
true.
Right. It's at least the French don't have tenure.
Yes, exactly.
They act like they do.
Granted. So I am curious why historians have fallen for it. So it's one thing so take Reagan as a counterexample, who lots of people thought was stupid or an actor kind of playing a president or a very sort of facile mind. And then his correspondence emerges and it's completely inconsistent with that. And he's actually a deeply committed and well-read philosophical conservative libertarian. And he's, writing letters talking about Hayek with people, which is not the Reagan I grew up understanding as a teenager who the president was. But okay, so history kind of adapts. Eisenhower, history is just now kind of starting to, the fact that your thesis is novel and interesting enough to develop into a book suggests that the world hasn't quite caught up with how you think we should understand Eisenhower. And so I guess my question, I can understand how the "aw shucks, I'm just a caveman lawyer" act kind of plays in real time, but I'm not sure I understand why it has been as persistent as it has, if it has as little merit as as you argue that it does.
So I would say that I'm not saying anything that academic historians and academic presidential historians probably wouldn't agree with. And there is that same kind of speaking of caveman lawyer, another great not Tim Hartman, Phil Hartman, role was precisely that with Reagan, right? Where I don't know if you remember this, where he has the Girl Scouts over and he's the doddering old man. And then as soon as they're out of the room, he flips over the table and it's a giant map of Nicaragua and he's moving positions around
right.
and saying, how many guns
can
you
joke.
Iran?
The point is, it's violating our sense of who Reagan is, right?
Yeah. And so I think academic historians have, certainly in more recent years, been much more on to Eisenhower than his contemporaries. And probably sort of popular historians of Eisenhower would sort of think about him because and there have been some really interesting books just analyzing him in a much deeper way. But I think one of the major obstacles to investigating Eisenhower in that much deeper way that I've certainly encountered as the writer of one of those books is he's not attractive to write about, right? Because he is kind of boring. And so that is the right, like he really does commit to character in a way that most other public figures who kind of tried to pull off the old shucks routine, George W. Bush kind of jumps to mind in that way, sort of acquiring his Texas accent in time for the presidency. That, you know, he never really was, he doesn't break character. I remember even reading an interview of him that Columbia did as part of an oral history project in 1970. So right, he's almost in the grave at that point. And you would sort of see it, and he would always kind of give you the, well, everyone's got to be on the same team, and you know, truth, mom, and apple pies. You know, it's like reading a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. But then every so often, he would just give these intense flashes of utter awareness and brilliance about military history, political history, the various dynamics at play in the Suez Crisis. Like, he's asked briefly about it, and he's like, well, the British were doing that, and then the French wanted to do this, and they figured, well, they could do that. And we didn't say table
and start
right, it's literally that moment where he sort of flips the table and then moves everything around, and then flips it back again. And he's like, but you know, I mean, that's boring stuff. You don't want to hear about that, right? And so he understood, you know, even he just committed to that character, I think, in ways that other politicians' vainglory probably prevents them from doing. But it's fascinating, and so like you have to be really patient with the texts and really like spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, why did he do that, right? What were the other options available to him? And one of the sort of last sort of keys that I've used for that is I've spent a lot of time and pain looking for his handwritten drafts of things, because one of the things you can see in his handwritten drafts, and he actually writes a lot pretty well, is what he crosses out and then starts again. And you can sort of get an impression of his thought process that's very difficult to do, and you have to be very patient with it. But it actually is quite revealing of that kind of sophisticated character once you really dig into it.
So the piece that I wanted to kind of pull out of what you said was the piece about the comparison to W, which is super interesting, because there's two different levels in which I think that you're talking about Ike, like kind of pawning off his massive intelligence or his strategy, like his ability to strategize or his ability to kind of think in this like very complicated and like multifaceted way. And one of them is with political allies. Like one of them is that you kind of act stupid in a way that like kind of makes you, is like to your advantage, like fox in a hen house type of thing, right? And then there's the other thing, but that's very much different than what I think George W. Bush was doing with the Texas accent. And this is kind of what I'll say about this, which is that like that was a pander to an entire electorate and like an entire body, right? I don't ever like looking back at like Ike and some of the things that I remember from like, I don't have a memory even looking like at any of his, and actually I'm more familiar with his campaign slogans and his campaign than I am with his presidency in a lot of ways. I don't remember that ever kind of being a gambit that he kind of tried to play. I don't think that there was ever, but maybe I'm wrong. But the second thing I was going to say is that this is the second time that you've talked about the Saturday Evening Post, which is of course
yeah.
Norman Rockwell and like great kind of like I mean like my parents I grew up in like a very kind of my parents were like a generation behind almost. Like I grew up in big band music and Glenn Miller and the Andrews Sisters and also the Saturday Evening Post, like covers. My dad would like get a Saturday Evening Post cover like at a garage sale and like frame it. And I'm like, you should be teaching me about the fucking Beatles. Like, what is going on here? Like, anyways, but like, this is a dead era. This is like a dead letter. Like, this is not a magazine that exists anymore in any real form. And like, what does that mean for what Ike could possibly bring to us now?
So that's a really savvy insight, right? This is the dead era that he was hyper appealing to. I don't think it's a mistake I don't think you can underestimate how much "I like Ike" was his campaign slogan, because he did
literally like all I knew about him for like when I was like,
right.
10 years old, right?
Yeah, and at the same time, I think you also see elements of the same kind of culture war you saw during George W. Bush administration. The description of Adlai Stevenson as an academic pinhead, and the delegitimization of sort of intellectual politics as a feature of sort of American politics is during the Eisenhower administration. He's one of the first presidential candidates to use what we'd now probably call like sabermetrics or big data to target a message and shape it, right? But all the while, it's this, well, I just like going out to the creek and fishing.
Shucks.
Right, all shucks, right? And so it's that same kind of, it changes in every era, right? The Saturday Evening Post is dead, but I do think there is this, you see in Eisenhower, this appeal against cynicism that I don't think was entirely insincere, but it was also used for incredible strategic purposes too.
Wait, so hold on, say that one more time. That you thought that Eisenhower was against cynicism?
Yeah, he has that. He was profoundly against cynicism in all of its forms, actually.
Like after coming out of like the Second World War, or like generally, like just like any type of like. I mean, I'm just kind of trying to like nail down what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I would actually go. I think the war is obviously a big part of it, right? Because he literally was in the thick of it. He saw the camps. He had a deep understanding of how fragile society really was, and so one of the very things that makes the 1950s culturally stultifying is this, I think, quite intuitive understanding by the ruling class led by Dwight Eisenhower that society is always on a razor's edge and can fall apart at any minute. And so order, stability, wholesomeness, community values, these are things that we must defend at all costs because they can go away like that. And I think that was a deep lesson he learned out of his experience in the Second World War. But I think it actually goes even deeper than that in his biography, if you'll permit me, because he also lost a son at a really young age. His firstborn, little Ike Jr., died when he was 3 years old of scarlet fever. And what was startling to me, this is 1920. Eisenhower was a young man, and he would have been 30 at the time. And what was striking to me was how intimate his relationship with his son was for a man of that era, especially. And he ends up, it is over the Christmas and New Year of 1920, and his son is put into quarantine. And so it's this experience of, I think, deep personal loss that a lot of people probably today can relate to, of not, in the same way that we are now sort of saying goodbye to our family members over an iPhone. He was essentially required to stand outside the room and just kind of wave to his boy as he withered and died over the course of like 3 weeks from the window of a hospital room. And he would and he stayed in the hospital, which to me, again, for a man of that period was just an incredibly striking level of love and intimacy with a child that really was uncommon at the time. And that kind of pain of personal loss really carries him through. You can see traces of this throughout his life, including his planning of the Normandy invasion for reasons I can get into with specifics. But this very acute sense of loss in humanity and how fragile the things we hold most dear really are. And he just sort of brings that kind of humanity and compassion to his work, even when he's being diabolically ruthless. He has like this very, again, just basic sense of care and kindness and fragility that really does define his character, and a lot of the kind of choices he makes, and including his I think probably both attraction to, but his easy appeal to the nostalgia that you see in the Saturday Evening Post. Because even in the 1950s, the nostalgia of the Saturday Evening Post was describing a dead world. Like that wasn't the 1950s.
That's kind of what I was getting at. But no, that's a wonderful counter. Thank you.
Before we go to audience questions, I want to pose 3 hypotheses as to why Eisenhower doesn't get a lot of love, and just have you respond briefly to each.
Yeah.
Number 1, we hate the 50s.
Yes, and I think that's true.
Like we just
do.
Yeah, we like the 60s. Well, because all the change that we celebrate, some of it had its roots in the 50s. It gets started in the 50s. It doesn't come to fruition until the 60s. And, I would
say a lot of it doesn't come until the 70s. And
well,
the 60s are much more like the 50s than we think of them as.
Okay, but the 50s, you get
the 50s
Brown
are square. The 50s
you get Brown v. Board of Ed, but you don't get it enforced.
Yeah.
So okay, you agree that he's like thought of as a creature of the 50s, and the 50s are just the height of uncool.
Wholesome.
Yeah, the least cool part of the 20th century is the 1950s.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Second thing, we've never really forgiven him for beating Adlai Stevenson twice.
I don't know how many of your viewers or listeners even know who Adlai Stevenson is, so I'm going to at least take a tepid.
How do you not know that?
I know who that is.
A million times. Also never won.
But don't you think that like liberal America, in its heart, Adlai Stevenson is like the closest thing to the lost cause that liberal America has?
They did him twice, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and I think so. Actually, it's funny you say that because Jill Lepore just did a really wonderful podcast series called, I think, Hidden History or something like that. And she did a whole episode on the defeat of Adlai Stevenson by the sort of highly commercialized Ike campaign machine, with deep distrust and skepticism, right? That this good man was essentially beaten by a man who would run for political office like he was selling Coca-Cola. And so, I think there's something true to that, right? That he defeated the intellectual left in an embarrassing and profound way.
Well, and also that this was a time when the academic left, or the, should have been ascendant. It had been like, there had been 16 years of continuous democratic rule. Dewey had managed to beat, Truman had managed to beat Dewey despite all expectations, including some the morning after the election, right? I mean, so you have this long ascendancy, and Ike just is this wall that ends it. And then you have this really appealing figure who is the obvious heir to that tradition, and Ike trounces him twice.
So yeah, I think there's something to that, but I think that disdain comes in part. I think that's actually related to your first cause for disdain. It's because Ike ends. It's because Ike is the president through the 1950s. It is because Ike essentially ends the 20-year dominance of the Democratic Party in the White House. I also think it's because we as a country don't like competent, quiet presidents. I think,
we're learning.
Although we're learning, right? And I
it took us a while.
I am so ready to like a quiet, boring, competent president.
Oh my God!
Right?
Has this been the nicest couple of months? Let me tell you.
Right. It took hitting rock bottom with an empty tequila bottle in a gutter for us to be like, maybe we just someone who does the job, right? But that's not the kind of person who lends himself to T-shirts, right? That's not the kind of person who lends himself to cultish adoration. And I think Eisenhower is, in a sense, the victim of his quiet competence in a large way. Now, that's also not to say, and certainly Ben knows this, like, I am not a hagiographer. I think Eisenhower is one of the most profoundly misunderstood figures of the 20th century, as well as being one of the most consequential. But he's by no means perfect. Even though he started the civil rights movement, the 1950s are also the era of sort of wink and a nod redlining, which has had knock-on effects for inequality to this very day. He is more than content to, despite some really initial skepticism based on his war experience, fully embrace a kind of unthinking anti-communism that ends up, I think, distorting American foreign policy in profound ways for a generation to come. He embraces, I said earlier on, he's the first American president, or one of the only American presidents throughout our history who does not actually begin a foreign war. But that does not mean he is averse to foreign intervention of all various kinds. He's the first American president to really embrace the use of covert action as a way of exercising foreign policy abroad, with sometimes highly unpredictable, highly disastrous consequences, whether or not you look at it as Nicaragua or Iran. And that kind of, kind of managerial sense of the presidency can also lead itself to a kind of sort of arrogance. I know better. These people are being mushy-headed, which I think can lead to that kind of embrace of highly dubious and often quite unpredictable means. So again, I'm not a hagiographer of Dwight Eisenhower, so please don't misunderstand me in that regard. But I do think there's something to him that speaks to our modern era in a way that is quite profound and worth celebrating, actually, too. I'm also not a hater on Dwight Eisenhower.
Last of my hypotheses, which is that his civil rights record is super ambiguous. And he started something, but he was really cautious about it. He was willing to send in federal troops only sort of late and with a lot of, there was no zest or verve to it. And so a lot of things that we think of as bedrock, we think of him as very halting, though he was actually more aggressive than Kennedy, and really didn't come to any significant fruition until the Johnson administration.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the fruition part, probably in terms of our historical memory, may be the most important piece of that, is that we remember Johnson as the great civil rights president, because that's when we got the Civil Rights Act. That's when we got our current Civil Rights Act.
I always think that that's been misplaced. And I always, it bothers me a lot. I feel like he inherited both Eisenhower and Kennedy's work and was able to and I'm not unhappy about it. I'm happy that he finished it out. He should get credit for that. But it wasn't these were not things that just started during his presidency.
Right.
It was
absolutely
more work than that. And so that's always been something that bothers me about the Johnson presidency.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't want to take Johnson's due away from him either. I think if you had Robert Caro on the show, he would vociferously argue for Johnson's pivotal role.
But he wouldn't be able to work the computer, so that's not going to happen.
But I also think so. I think Eisenhower had the I think Eisenhower. If you get into the record, and I don't want to get too much into this because I think it'll be distracting, but had fairly. We would not be okay with a lot of the things that Eisenhower said about race today. They're not the sort of visceral, bone-chomping racism of his era. Quite the opposite. He was quite hostile to that kind of mentality. But there is a certain noblesse oblige to some of his attitudes about race that he inherited, by virtue of leading the Republican Party, which at the time was the Civil Rights Party. It's the Democratic Party, really starting with its ascendancy under Woodrow Wilson, that really makes segregationism a part of its platform, and the Republicans had been, a significant counterweight to that, with complicated results under the FDR administration, certainly. But he actually did have a commitment to civil rights. I think it was out of a sense of noblesse oblige, which makes it a lot less attractive than it probably we would like to remember it. But I also think he was by no means radical in that respect either. And so his views on civil rights are not relatable from our mores today. And I would actually say the radical steps he took, like the forcible desegregation of the schools, for him had far less to do with the civil rights cause than his deep, abiding hatred of disorder, and chaos. And the idea that you would have state governments shutting the schools against a Supreme Court order and preventing children from being allowed to go to school, I think cut to him far more than the broader civil rights implications of what he was doing.
I have long since asking for people to do the right thing for the right reason. It's hard enough to get to the right thing. Let them get there however they want. Dr. Livingston, it's good to see your face.
Good to see you. Interesting conversation. I didn't know a whole lot about Eisenhower, so this is interesting. You hear the term Eisenhower Republican, and I'm wondering if you could talk about what that means, and also how would Eisenhower fare in today's Republican Party and in the American political scene in general? Thanks.
Great question.
Eisenhower would be with the Bernie Sanders wing, just based on a pure policy by policy basis. No, the old idea of Eisenhower Republican is the merger essentially of the business wing of the Republican Party, which had long existed, right? Going back, that he did not invent. That's the 1920s. But the merger of the business wing of the Republican Party with the kind of suburban internationalist, part of the middle of America that could basically move between the various parties in the 1940s, and had deeply rejected the Republican Party until that point. One, as I think I may have mentioned earlier in the talk, one of the reasons no one knows what party Eisenhower had a lot of he had sort of the persona that Colin Powell had in the 90s. No one actually knew what party he was going to belong to. And he actually even has a conversation in the summer, if I'm remembering this correctly, the summer of 1952 with Truman, who actually asks him to run as his successor for the Democratic Party, in order to protect the United Nations, to ensure sort of the internationalist world order going forward.
And it is not a foregone conclusion in 1952 that the Republican Party is not going to nominate Taft or one of his ilk. I mean, this is the period of where the Bricker Amendment comes within this one state, I think, of becoming part of the Constitution.
That's right.
This is a totally fucked up period where we really came pretty close to lurching back toward major isolationism again.
That's absolutely right. And so one of the major sort of ploys, and I think it's only the fair word for it, that he embraces, is that by becoming a Republican, he can beat Taft because he's this just broadly Saturday Evening Post consensus figure. And so by becoming by sort of unifying the business wing of the Republican Party with the sort of broad, vaguely political, but generally nonpartisan internationalist vein of the country, he's able to essentially box out the isolationist wing. And that sets a precedent for the Republican Party that largely exists.
It persists until Trump. It's actually an amazing accomplishment, and its persistence. He banished, he at the political level and Bill Buckley at the intellectual level basically banished the crazies.
Yeah.
At least on the international affairs side. And the Republican Party becomes a fairly conventional center-right party until Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. Now, there are the veins, sort of the Goldwater Vein. Ronald Reagan, I think, did a lot. And it was interesting, actually, to read this 1970 interview specifically because Ronald Reagan comes up. And one of the things Ike says is, Ronald Reagan's not nearly as crazy as he seems. And I've talked to the man. And there's this kind of there's almost this sort of laying of hands that you could argue happened between Eisenhower and Reagan, but that had this sort of that did sort of have this half-century long successful effort to box the crazies out of the Republican Party and to create a national consensus around certain values and ideals, primarily internationalism. Some others that you may disagree with too. On both sides you might hear imperialism substituted for internationalism, but I think that's one of his great, incredible political accomplishments.
Andrew McCurdy, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Actually, my uncle was in the Birch Society, great uncle, and he got shot over a raccoon fight. That was kind of his style of doing things in those days. Anyway, Eisenhower has become one of my heroes in the last few years, and however, Hofstadter wrote Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, in part because he beat Adlai Stevenson twice. What was Eisenhower's opinion of kind of that tradition of anti-intellectualism, and did he intentionally encourage it in himself or others?
It's a complicated answer. So as I mentioned, he was the president of Columbia University. He founded Columbia Business School. One of the things he did in his fairly brief, like basically 3-year tenure as the running Columbia, was create interdisciplinary workshops, which were largely unheard of. He had this deep chafing aversion to people who specialized in specific areas of knowledge without trying to integrate the viewpoints and ideas, either practical or intellectual, from other disciplines. And so he really was what we would now call interdisciplinary in his thinking, and was profoundly intellectual, but also deeply, I think, instinctively skeptical of anyone who specialized too much and didn't have a value for the practical in the world. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think part just, again, Kansas farm boy upbringing. I don't think that was insincere. But I think he also had spent enough time in the United States military to see plans go badly, so that he had this sort of instinctive understanding that what we would actually call philosophically American pragmatism from the turn of the 20th century. So, he was by no means an anti-intellectual. He had a deep appreciation and an embrace of expertise. Last sort of point I'll answer, long answer to a short question, is his own decision-making process. He never allowed himself to, when he had to make a big decision, he would always make the decision in a room full of all the people who had been giving him his points of view. He was sort of adamantly against ever allowing someone to be the last person to talk to him before he made a decision. Instead, he would sort of demand people debate vociferously and as hard as possible for the positions in front of him before he would make a decision, because he understood sort of the fragility of human thinking. And so he was a big embracer of expertise.
Christopher Argyris, who does not seem to be in his native habitat. The floor is yours.
No, I am. I just I moved houses about a month ago. So. Oh,
but you seem to have skis in the background.
No, it's a long story. I have too many skis in this flat. Hi, Michelle. So you mentioned the civil rights record earlier. I would contend that that the integration of the Army by Truman was the beginning of the civil rights era. But anyways, my question has to do with let's see, what did I say here?
Again, don't disagree with that. I think that's like I wasn't giving Eisenhower the credit for being the founder of this by far, but
okay. So UVA historian William Hitchcock, who also has written on Eisenhower,
and who we should have on the show,
said that that Eisenhower was the most consequential man of the 1945-1960 period. But you could also say that he was conspicuously absent from two major stories of the 50s. I mentioned the civil rights. We could talk about that, but more conspicuously absent from the Senator Joe McCarthy's communist witch hunts. Why must we give Ike a pass on moral leadership simply because he personally didn't see an upside to taking a stand on either? I guess he thought that if he spoke out against McCarthy, he would only give McCarthy fuel to sort of say, "Look, I'm doing a crusade, and the president's on the other side."
Yeah. So this is so there are two answers. One. Taking the criticism at face value, and that's fair. One of the things that I don't think holds up well is Ike really did become a pretty tough anti-communist. He understood anti-communism he understood its political value. I think he actually genuinely came to embrace it. I don't think it was an insincere, cynical ploy on his part. And so he was never going to be on the ACLU side of it, fight about communism or anti-communism. That's just a fact. It's just his personality and his thinking of the time. When that came to Joseph McCarthy, I don't disagree. I think the criticism is well-founded. The one thing I would say is and this is not an area I've studied too intensely, but I've at least seen a fair bit of evidence to suggest that Eisenhower ensured that the Army McCarthy hearings would go as badly as possible. In part, that may have been less his affection for communism or sympathy for people who were accused of being communists than his affection for the Army. And so it was kind of like coming into his house. But he did have a pretty big role in the delegitimization of McCarthy in the Army McCarthy hearings. And so, again, it's a mixed record. He's not a saint. No one in history is, and they shouldn't be treated as such. And I think that's a totally valid criticism, that he was willing to allow, including on the civil rights side, a lot of bad things to happen, so long as they didn't cross certain lines that he deemed unacceptable.
All right, David Priest, you get the penultimate question today. And by the way, the post-discussion poll is going up momentarily, so be sure to vote.
Right.
The floor is yours,
Christopher
David.
Christopher already got the core of my question, so I'm going to shift it. Michelle, first of all, great that you're doing this. There can't be enough new good takes on Eisenhower as far as I'm concerned. But I'm going to pick up on something in the chat, and I think in one of the questions, which is golf. Trump obviously made golf in the presidency something it had never been, except for Eisenhower and Wilson. Eisenhower, in what I've seen, was not criticized very much for the golf because he was a delegating leader and things were getting done across almost all levels of government. But I'm wondering if you've done enough digging yet to see if you have any interesting takes on the golfing and the presidency as something that requires 18 hours a day, or else you're not a complete president.
So interesting. It's an interesting comparison, and an unfortunate one. Eisenhower definitely had. He was so. There are two answers to that, actually. One is that Eisenhower did work 18-hour days. It's actually incredible when you look at his schedules. He really was one of those people who, embraced the notion the English sometimes talked about of effortless superiority, where he made it look like he wasn't doing that much, but was in ruthless control. He was the guy flipping over the map, like Ronald Reagan was imagined to be.
There's a term for that the Europeans have. How have I not learned this before? What is it? Effortless superiority?
Yeah,
that sounds so awful. That sounds like
I don't think the way the British use that term, it's an individual thing. He behaved with effortless superiority.
Yeah, he behaved with effortless superiority. Right.
It's not like a racial.
But that sounds like no. I'm not making it sound.
No, it's just like he made it look easy.
Yeah, he made it look easy. Yeah.
Okay.
It's one of the so full disclosure, in that PhD that Ben betrayed the world that I have. So my college.
I have no idea. It was a total accident.
So effortless superiority was actually the motto of my college at Oxford, which sort of betrayed all the worst stereotypes of Oxford.
Isn't it like having that as your motto, like being like
completely obnoxious? Yes.
Yeah, isn't it like I'm the most humble person in the world? I should win all of the prizes for humility. Like,
yeah, that's true. I don't defend it. I'm just betraying it. But so one of the interesting things, and this is something I've been trying to work on actually in my own portrait of Eisenhower, is he's also a man of like meticulous hobbies and habits. He's actually not a bad painter and artist. It's actually incredible how good a lot of his art was. And there are all these.
Shares that with George W. Bush.
Oh, he leaves George W. Bush in the shade. He actually just had this very. So one of the fun things, I'm going to try and see if I can get the publisher to include these sort of throughout the book, is when he was when he was in long meetings with world famous people, Churchill, de Gaulle, you name it, he would like sketch them like in his notebook as like a doodle. And so there are all of these just like really revealing portraits of how he is seeing these people in real time. He was a man of sort of like these meticulous habits. He played bridge compulsively. I think golf probably, when he got back to the United States, was sort of his sort of compulsive habit that he would sort of use as his way of vectoring his kind of anxious mind and perfectionism.
Mickey, you get the last question today.
Okay.
Look at Mickey's background.
Yeah, we got Eisenhower in the background.
Oh, really? Where? Oh, yeah, right there. Very well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did prepare.
I have my Eisenhower mug somewhere here.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm calling
where's
from
your
Kansas.
preparation, Michelle?
Sorry.
And one of the things I came across in studying about Eisenhower was that in response to Sputnik, he assembled a presidential science advisory committee and a real blue ribbon panel. And they had education reforms, which really changed the trajectory of education, especially science and education and engineering education. And it called for more participation by women. Even in the late 50s, there was this finding that it was hurting national defense capability by not having enough women. And I was fascinated by that, about how that came out, and Eisenhower promoted that idea very directly at the time, but it doesn't seem to get much attention.
That's a fact. I'd never actually heard that. And it's not especially surprising. Like, he had this, kind of, again, Ben Franklin-y demand for like rational empirical thought, right? He didn't like, he had this sort of chafing instinct against pre-existing biases that would lead people to make bad decisions. Like, he was always looking for more and more diverse information. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. And he had a lot of women in his life who were like pretty, influential confidants. The most controversial of which is Kay Summersby, who some people may know, who's been, I don't want to get into it here because I'm still researching it. I don't know that I have an opinion, but has been largely rumored to be a mistress of his during the Second World War. She was an Irish, he got her inducted into the Women's Air Corps, and she was his like personal assistant secretary, but actually closest confidant as well. They spent literally almost every day together throughout much of the Second World War. So I never heard that. That's a really interesting.
Yeah. It was called the Killian Report.
That's really cool. I will check that out. It doesn't surprise me, but it's like, but it's actually like kind of really interesting to hear that too.
We're going to leave it there. Mickey, thank you for that. I'm sure Michelle will follow up. Michelle, thank you for joining us. You're a great American and a friend of the show.
Happy to do it.
We will be back tomorrow with Josh Sharfstein of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health to talk vaccines, vaccinations, and how's it all going. That'll be 22 hours and 55 minutes from now at 2100 UTC. And until then, Kate, who's wearing a dog shirt, which I am not, but who is muted and therefore.
Wait, can I break your closer? I'm so sorry. Yeah. What was the results of the poll?
Oh, the result of the poll. Dwight Eisenhower is really boring goes from 28% down to 5.5%. No, he is not really boring goes from 72% to 94.6%. So this is a big win for our guest today.
Poor Adlai Stevenson is still in the truck.
That he should share with his publisher as evidence that there is a market for this book. And Kate, what do we say?
We don't have fun anymore, but at least we have creepy dog shirt eyes and Adlai Stevenson. Well, we don't really.
Yeah, he's dead, but the dog shirts live forever.
Dog shirts forever. Bye.
See you tomorrow.